One of the ways that we can modify a triad is with inversion, by changing which of the three notes of the triad sit in the bottom position. I'd like to show you another modification that we can make of the triad. And let's go back to our G major triad, which I've written over here on the left. And here we have our root position G major triad. So we have a G, we have a B, and we have a D on the top. And just before I show you what we're going to do, let me just remind you, each of these notes has a title or a function. The bottom note, the G, is the root. The middle note, the B, is the third. And the top note, the D, is the fifth. And no matter how I alter this triad, no matter how I rearrange those notes, those titles or those functions are always going to remain. The G is always going to stay the root of this chord, the B is always going to remain the third of this chord, and the D is always going to remain the fifth of this chord. So let me show you one of the other ways that we can modify this chord. We can modify this chord by changing the spacing of the notes above the bottom note. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example here. Let's change the spacing of this root position triad by moving the B, by moving the third. We're going to move that third up the octave to the B that is way up here above the staff. So in this root position triad, I'm moving this B up an octave, up there. And for now, I'll keep the other two notes exactly the same. So we'll have that D that's the fifth and the G that is the root. So now I have the G followed by the D followed by the B. I'm going to play that for you, but let me just remind you what our root position triad on the left sounds like. Now, when I open that chord up and put the B up on top, here's what it sounds like. That gives us a totally different perspective on that chord. It's still the same chord. It's still exactly the same chord because we still have the G, the B, and the D. That hasn't changed. In fact, it's still a triad that is in root position because notice the G is still the bottom note. The root is still on the bottom, so it's root position. But just by shifting the spacing of those top notes, we've created a completely different sound for this chord. In fact, I could even shift the spacing of the bottom note of the root, and as long as that root remains on the bottom, in fact, let me do that right now. I'm going to take that G and move it down by an octave. And so it'll land here, doing this in the bass clef. Here we go. So now the G is way, way down here in the bass clef, an octave below. Then we have the D and the B. There's yet another way of positioning those chords. And notice, again, the root is the bottom note. The root is still in the bottom, so this is still a root position chord. We call this process, by the way, of rearranging the notes in the chord. This is one aspect of something called voicing, which it entails, at least in part, how we arrange the notes of a chord. And voicing is one of the really interesting things that we can do with harmony that go beyond just what we can do with a sort of a normal root position triad. I'll put that G back where it was for a moment. When we do this, when we space out the notes of the triad like this, we call this open position. And that probably makes pretty intuitive sense to you. Because we literally have opened up the chord. There's now space in there. Again, this is still a triad because we still have the root, the third, and the fifth. Here's the root, Here's the third, way up here now, but still the third, and here's the fifth. And notice we know that this is open position, by the way, because there are places, there are spaces in between the notes where we could fit other notes within the triad. For instance, between the G and the D, there's a space right here where we could fit, and we did in the previous chord, we could fit the B. Between the D and the B, there's a space, in fact, right here where we could fit the root. So there's all this sort of open space in the middle of the chord. When we build a chord when there's no open space, we call that close position. Close, C-L-O-S-E position. And here, the chord that as I originally wrote it right here, is in close position, because there is no note of the chord that we could fit in between G and B. These are as closely packed as they possibly can be. There's no chord that we could fit in between G and D. Those notes are as closely packed in as they possibly can be. So that is close position. So open position and close position. There's only one way within a particular inversion to do close position, but there can be many, many ways to create an open position within a particular inversion.